Well, with much to put in this morning, it is a slightly shorter message. You'll be, I'm sure, grateful to hear, but quite a lot of reading from the book of Numbers this morning. And really the story speaks for itself, and yet it's good for us to consider these things this morning as we study the book of Numbers, a book of obedient hope and great failure, as we're learning. And this great failure has been a theme now for a number of weeks. We've witnessed the Israelites stumbling in their grumbling and in their complaining as they make their journey to the promised land. We've been thinking about rebellion in the camp for the last couple of weeks. Chapters 11 and 12. But today, the level of revolt, the level of insurrection amongst the people moves to a new level, you might say. That leads me to label today's message as the Kadesh catastrophe. So far, the nature of the discontent that's been expressed by the Israelites has ranged from journeying hardships, familial jealousy, and even boredom with bread. That's not to say that these incidents were not serious. Quite the contrary, they were. But today, as we heard in our readings, there is a total national disaster. And it has long-lasting, deadly consequences. The story, as you heard it unfold, is pretty plain. It prompts me in chapter 13 to begin with a sight test. You know how we need sight tests? I can see a number of you looking back at me with glasses. You've obviously failed your sight tests in some way. And we'll all get there eventually, I'm sure. Here's a sight test that I pose for us all this morning. The question I want to ask you today is the question that is posed to the Israelites, especially the 12 spies who surveyed the land as the people waited near the border with Canaan, the promised land. The crucial matter is this: what can you see? What can you see as you contemplate the world around you and your future? Now, the answer to this question, we realize, is the defining factor in this incident. And as you move into chapter 14, you see how momentous, how catastrophic were the people's response to the things that were seen. As you see at the beginning of chapter 13, a representative from each tribe is charged with spying out the land that awaits. And this is done, as verse 3 states, at the command of God. However, in the account of this period of the nation's history that is parallel in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1, verse 19, it seems that it's the people themselves who first request that spies go out ahead and survey the land, despite the fact that God had already told them what the promised land was like. You can see, therefore, can't you, that seeds of doubt have begun to spring up amongst the people. And you could say that God's instructions, therefore, in Numbers 13 to Moses, to send some spies out at his command, are really a gracious response to his fearful people. It's a concession of our God once more in his mercy. So what we discover from the report that the spies bring back after their 40-day expedition is quite telling. Firstly, we see in our sight test opportunities. They see opportunity. This survey is comprehensive. Moses asks them to consider the land and its condition, its soil, the trees, its produce, and he also asks for a report of the inhabitants in the land, their strength, of their towns and their defences and their cities. And in short, what we learn is that Canaan was indeed all that God had promised it to be. God doesn't lie. What he said, they saw. Yes, there were concerns about the inhabitants, described as giants, but there was these magnificent bunches of grapes they brought back. There was ample proof that this was, as God had said, a land flowing with milk and honey. I wonder what report you and I would have brought back if we'd been part of that expedition that day, or those 40 days. Would we, I wonder, have focused as the spies should on the clear evidence that God had been true and trustworthy in his promises, in his dealings with his people? And I guess what I'm asking is whether you and I would rightly focus, even today, on the goodness of God towards each one of us. Are we viewing things the way we ought today? Are we seeing the opportunities God gives, the benefits of this world that he has made, or the good things that we can do in living for him and in serving him? Now, I was thinking about this week that maybe there's an element of personality in the way we see things as individuals. The optimists amongst us see a glass half full. The pessimists see a glass half empty, maybe. But we think that's enough. But it's not. In reality, our personalities aren't trustworthy guides. Our personalities are to be mastered, not to be our masters in all things. And this is an important point. We should never think that making the best of life, making the best of the spiritual opportunities that exist, is only really easy or possible for the optimists, the jolly Christians, the carefree ones, the committed ones. That's not an option in the Christian life. This seeing opportunity should be the aim of all of us, shouldn't it? We should never think it's easy for you, but what about me? Because as believers, we all need to see the opportunities that God gives us to live our best life for him. And each one of us should be focused, therefore, on taking God at his word, despite the difficulties that may arise. And this brings me on to touch on what the spies also reported, therefore. What else did they see? Well, alongside opportunities, yes, boy, did they see obstacles. We see in verses 26 to 33 that 10 of the spies also emphasized obstacles as well as opportunities. And they concluded that Israel was too weak to conquer their enemies. The people of the land were giants, the city walls were high, and they felt like grasshoppers. Unbelief had taken a hold. Seeds of doubt had grown and flourished. Warren Wiersbe, the great American writer, commentator on this section, says this: unbelief blinded them to God's greatness, and it magnified their own weakness. That's what unbelief does. Makes other things big and you small. It's the wrong way around when it comes to our God, but there it is. And this drives home to us once more the lesson. The lesson, of course, in the book of Numbers is walking by faith and not by sight. Even though today we're dealing with what the spies saw. You know, despite what we may observe all around us, we must remember firstly what God has said to us. Do you get that? Despite what you see, remember what you've heard. And here we recall God had told his people of the many good things that this land had in store for them. But they focused on the barriers rather than the blessings. And this, of course, displayed an attitude of fear, wrongful fear in their hearts. The largeness, the numerousness of the inhabitants cause them to say, we cannot go on, we cannot defeat them, we cannot enter this land, even when God said otherwise. Now that's serious. That's a big problem. In fact, it's deadly, we shall find. And in speaking again about walking by faith and not by sight, I want to add this. In life, it's true, all of us will see both opportunities and obstacles. We'll see both blessings and barriers. But listen, actually, walking in the way God has called us has nothing to do with our eyes. I don't have to remind you, I hope, that as Christians we are called to live by the reality of unseen things and not the fantasy of what we see all around us. This isn't real and true and lasting. Not at all. Of course, we are not to think that what God requires of us as Christians is to adopt a silly, naive, unrealistic attitude to life. That's not the calling of our God. He's not asking us to wander around with our eyes shut when he calls us to walk by faith. That's not the case at all. Our walk of faith is, in fact, a call to walk this life with our eyes very much open, in fact, wide open. And I say that because really walking by faith and not by sight is a heart attitude, not an ocular issue. Paradoxically, then, walking by faith and not by sight is an exercise in seeing what exists in the world, even if it's in opposition to all that you hold dear, and yet still trusting the God of all goodness. And paradoxically again, that means that we are to see what cannot be seen, which is where faith truly plays its part. But sadly, that's not what the spies who went into this land did. The fragility of their faith was displayed. It had been there in chapters 11 and 12, and it's now descended into outright insurrection, as we'll witness. Before we leave chapter 13, there's just one further sight that I want you to observe before this chapter concludes. There is a shining great example, isn't there, towards the end of chapter 13, and that's brought by the man Caleb. Verse 30. What did he see? Well, Caleb saw opportunities, he saw obstacles, but chiefly in all things he saw his God. He saw the Lord. That trumped everything. Caleb was a man of great faith, therefore. He didn't worry about the great size of a problem because he trusted in a great God. And I suppose the questions for him in life were not how big is the problem or how big am I? How big is my God was always on Caleb's mind. And in a sense, he had the same view of the obstacles as God did. How did God see these giants in the land? Well, Isaiah 40 verse 22 allows us to read that God actually sees people like grasshoppers. God sees people like grasshoppers. So should we, is the way Caleb reasoned. But the unbelieving spies were not looking at the situation like Caleb from God's point of view. One commentator I read now observes that when we contemplate this walking by faith, as Caleb did, he said that means the future is your friend and every enemy will be defeated. Have you ever thought of that? It struck me. The future for the Christian is our friend to be embraced. The past, which kept us from Christ with all its sins, is an enemy defeated by Christ. The future we can welcome. Tomorrow is a friend. That's a great way of thinking. Striking thought. We can look back on our past, but also we can look forward, knowing that our future is bright, it's safe, it's secure, it's glorious. It's a friend even that we can welcome in the certain hope that all obstacles in our way can be removed. And that's Caleb's attitude. I trust it'll be ours today too. But sadly, most of these spies failed their sight test. But now in chapter 14, we come to a further test. Not sight, but faith. And this would have massive consequences for the nation. We see here that the negative report of the majority of the spies caused a destructive chain of events to unfold. Here they are, very briefly, in verses 1 to 10. Unbelief led to rebellion. The people wept, complained, looked back to Egypt, and called for a new leader. Enough of this Moses. They wanted to stone the good news bringers, Caleb and Joshua. Joshua's plea for courage in verse 7 is made, but they won't have it. Here is the evidence of the faith test of the people. Faith looks ahead with courage, doesn't it? But as we've already seen, unbelief has taken hold. It's looking back with complaint, and it only sees disaster to come. True faith, which Joshua calls for, would have united the people of God. But unbelief, it looks for someone to blame. Whose fault is it? Do you know that's all you hear today in your news media? Whose fault is it? How sad. Joshua spoke. There's time to repent. There's time to seek God's face. But the people refused to listen. It's a familiar tale which then unfolds. Verses 11 to 19. Rebellion then leads to insurrection or terrible trouble. And there's a need for intercession from Moses. Moses once again stands between God and his people, between God and judgment. In verse 12, God threatens to destroy the people, all of them, apart from Moses. He offers Moses a way out. You can start again with a new nation. Interesting, isn't it? What an offer. Get rid of this grumbling lot, just you and me. Moses turns that offer down. He intercedes for these grumbling, complaining people. He pleads for them on the basis of God's character and glory, which he knows. He says in verse 18, the Lord is slow to anger, abounding in love, and forgiving sin and rebellion. Moses uses God's own words to reveal what he wants to happen next. And in verses 20 to 38, we see how this intercession leads to pardon. God pardoned these people. You should have fallen off your seats at this point. These people. But at the same time, he judged the sin. Here's a demonstration of the wonderful mercy, but also the awesome judgment and justice of God. It's a lesson that the New Testament expands on many times. Verses 7 and 8 of Galatians 6 tell us how God is merciful, but he will punish justly sin. Well, here then is this intercession that leads to pardon. And finally, the resulting judgment of this faith test is then delivered. What happens? All the people are temporarily spared, but the 10 faithless spies immediately die. They die of a plague divinely delivered. And the nation, well, you have 40 years, a year for every day that you spied out the land, to now wander in the desert. All 20-year-old adult males, save Caleb and Joshua, are consigned to die in the desert. There's a simple lesson being driven home here as we close. Put simply, faith brings life, unbelief brings death. That's chapter 14. That's how chapter 14 ends. Despite the mercy displayed by God, there's a further display of inglorious folly to follow. You'd have thought these people would have learned a big lesson that day. But look how it ends. Pardon is great, but this pardon led to presumption. Presumption on the part of the forgiven. What should have been a great cause of serious contemplation and a humbling of hearts actually resulted in the Israelites now acting stubbornly. Like mules, they then change into charging horses and rush into the hill country, though God has said this is not the path they should take. They think they can defeat these enemies, having been saved by God. Surely we've sinned, they say. Let's go out and do something wonderful. And disaster strikes. There's a heavy defeat that's inflicted upon them. What do we learn as we close, friends? It's this: God's forgiveness is never given so that we can run our own course in life. God's forgiveness is never given so that we can fight our own fights, think our own thoughts, establish our own authority. That's not why God forgives us. He makes us his, to think his thoughts, to be conformed to his likeness, to be like him. God forgives so that we might fear and serve him, as Psalm 30 verse 4 tells us. You know, we're never to tempt God by our actions. Though God will step in, we are never called to cause him to step in. Do you hear that? It's not your job to provoke God, to save you time and again. That's what we learn here as chapter 14 ends. We must not tempt God by any of our actions or words. Here was a fleshly act done by a hasty people. We want to avoid those things, don't we? Surely we do. And sadly we see again that death was the result. Here's a question: flesh or faith? What's it to be? Flesh or faith? What will ultimately rule in your life? Flesh or faith? Good man. The flesh can never accomplish what only faith can do. Never. So as I close, let me just turn the spotlight, not on the two leavers here this morning, on the leaving seats, but on these two men, Caleb and Joshua. How are we to behave like them when they were ignored, abused, overlooked by the world? Caleb and Joshua were they a minority that day. Ever been in a minority? A minority like this? Not just 2 in 12, but it looks like 2 in a million. Well, even when we see the whole nation turning against them and their lives were in danger, they maintained true faith in God. Wonderful example of faith from these two men. They knew God's will for the people, and crucially, they stood their ground based on the knowledge they possessed. They weren't people pleasers. Boy, that's true. And ultimately, of course, it's not important whether we please people in this life. That's not your job. Not at all. What's important is that we please God always. So like Joshua, like Caleb, yes, we will suffer. We must suffer, I hasten to add. Struggling in a minority even of one at times. But in the end, as the New Testament scriptures reveal, God will vindicate all those who trust in him, and he will enable us to overcome, to complete the task that the Lord Jesus Christ has given us. Acts 20:24 tells us that. We have the testifying task of the good news of God's grace. May it be so for us as we go forward as God's people, passing the sight test and certainly acing the faith test that lies before us today. Amen.